All right, welcome back, word nerds. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're all about creative writing.
Um, Always a good topic, right?
The best. So we found this really cool YouTube video. It's packed with advice from a writer who is just like so clearly passionate about, the craft.
Yeah, and we're gonna kind of break it down and help you pull out those little golden nuggets that'll really make a difference in your writing.
Exactly. Like imagine you're sitting down, ready to write, right? You got your novel, your short story, or even just an email that needs that extra oomph. We're giving you the tools to level up.
Seriously, think of us as your writing coaches, helping you navigate all the advice out there and find, what works for you.
I love that. Okay, so the video starts with this like super fundamental question. What even is good writing?
Right, it's like what is good art? Kind of subjective, right?
Totally. But like art, there are some things that most people agree make writing, good. The video talks about clarity, engaging the reader, emotional impact, thought-provoking ideas, and enjoyability.
And I really like that last one, enjoyability. It's a reminder that writing is meant to be experienced, not just dissected.
So true. And the video makes a great point. What one person enjoys might not resonate with another. So this deep dive is about you figuring out what good writing means for you.
Exactly. Every writer has their own voice. Part of the journey is figuring out what you connect with as a reader.
Okay, so let's get practical. Let's talk tips. The first one, I gotta say, really grabbed my attention. It's all about what the video calls the adverb slayer.
Oh yeah, the infamous Stephen King quote, right? The road to hell is paved with adverbs. It's a little dramatic, but definitely gets your attention.
It totally does. Why do you think Stephen King feels so strongly about adverbs? I mean, it can't just be about the word itself, right?
Right, I think it's more about the power of strong verbs. Like when we use adverbs to prop up weaker verbs, the writing loses its energy. It's like he's saying, dig deeper, find those verbs that pack a punch.
So it's about finding that one perfect word that creates the emotion or the image you want the reader to feel.
Exactly. Instead of she walks quickly to the store, was kind of blah, you could say she's hurried, she dashed, she scurried. See, each one paints a slightly different picture, adds a layer of nuance.
I see what you mean. And that actually reminds me, I catch myself doing that all the time in my own writing, using an adverb when a better verb would have been like way more effective.
It's all about refining those choices, making the writing as strong as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, ready for the next tip. This one is about tightening up your writing, and it might surprise you because it involves taking words out.
Ah, the art of less is more. Sometimes cutting back can actually make your writing stronger.
That's it. The video talks about these sneaky little words, relative pronouns, things like that, when, where, who, and whom.
Right, and they're grammatically correct and all, but often they don't actually add anything to the sentence. They could even make it sound a bit plunky.
The video had a great example. They took the sentence, no one knew the reason that she was there. And just by removing that, it becomes, no one knew the reason she was there. So much smoother.
Totally. It's subtle, but it makes a big difference in how the sentence flows.
Exactly. And it's not about making it shorter just to be shorter. It's about making every single word count.
Making sure each element is working hard.
Okay, so we've tackled adverbs and relative pronouns. Now, for a tip that really gets to the heart of storytelling, show, don't tell.
Ah, yes. This is where the writing really comes alive. It's so cool to see how just changing a few things can totally transform a scene.
Me too. And the video uses this like really basic sentence. Aiden felt nervous as he reached for the jar. We're just told how he feels.
Right, it's like a summary of his emotions instead of letting the reader feel them along with him.
Exactly. But then they change it to Aiden's hand trembled as he reached for the jar. Boom. Now we're not told he's nervous. We're shown it through the trembling.
And that's what pulls the reader in. They start to imagine the scene, fill in the blanks, and actually connect with the character's emotions.
Instead of just being told they're part of the experience.
Right, you're letting the reader's imagination do some of the work. And that makes it so much more powerful.
I love that. Okay, ready for another tip? This one is all about energy. It's about sentence variety.
Ah, the rhythm of language. It's like music, right? You don't want every sentence to sound the same.
The video starts with a simple explanation of the different types of sentences, like simple, compound, and complex. But then they show how powerful it is to mix them up. They use this passage about Carol as an example.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me about Carol.
Okay, so imagine this. Carol saw a star. It was shining. She was desperate to reach it. She wanted to escape this world. Carol knew she couldn't. What do you notice about those sentences?
They all sound kind of the same, like a list almost. There's no flow, no connection between them.
Exactly, but when you use a mix of sentence types, it changes everything. The video rewrote it like this. Carol looked out her window and saw a star shining in the distance. It was a beacon of hope. Yet, despite her longing to reach the star, Carol knew she was trapped.
Oh, wow, okay. Now it has rhythm. The longer sentences create this longing feeling, and then those short ones at the end, they add a sense of finality. Yeah.
And it's all done just by changing the sentence structure. It's amazing what a difference that can make.
It's like grammar isn't just about rules. It's about using those rules to create a specific effect.
Okay, so we've talked about strengthening our writing at the sentence level, but what about that very first hurdle? The blank page, the blinking cursor, writer's block.
Oh, man, every writer's worst nightmare, right? That feeling of being stuck, like the words just won't come.
Totally. And the video has this really simple but powerful advice. Just start. They say just get those words down, even if they're not perfect.
I'm all about that. I can't tell you how many times I've stared at a blank page, totally frozen because I felt like what I wrote had to be brilliant right away. But the truth is, you got to just start somewhere, even if it's messy.
Yeah. And they make a great point. A finished bad story is better than no story at all.
Exactly. Give yourself permission to write badly. That's how you get to the good stuff.
And for all of you listening, I think this is so important to remember. It's so easy to get caught up in thinking you're not good enough. But writing is a journey, and every journey starts with a single step.
Sometimes the hardest part is just that first step, but once you take it, you're on your way.
Okay, so now we've got our creative juices flowing, we've faced a blank page, we're writing our story. But here's where the real magic happens. Editing.
Ah, yes, this is where the raw material gets shaped and polished. It's where the real work begins.
Right. They say the real work starts after the first draft. They even suggest putting your writing aside for a bit before editing so you can see it with fresh eyes.
That is so important. It's so easy to miss your own mistakes when you're too close to the work.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that editing isn't about fixing your writing. It's about making it the best it can be.
Right. It's about refining the story, making sure your message is clear, and that the writing is doing what you want it to do.
And, the video also mentions finding inspiration, which I think is important for both writing and editing.
Inspiration is like the fuel for creativity.
Totally. But the video uses this as a chance to plug Audible, recommending Stephen King's On Writing. It's a great book, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on finding inspiration beyond books.
That's a great question. I mean, books are amazing, but there's inspiration everywhere. Sometimes the best thing is to get away from your desk and, just experience the world.
I love that. So we've covered a lot. Slang adverbs, embracing editing, finding inspiration. But there's one thing I'm still curious about. The video talks about editing being crucial, but what are some red flags in our own writing that tell us it needs more work?
Oh, that's a good one. So one thing to know, editing is important, but it's another to know what to actually look for.
Right, like having a toolbox full of tools, but not knowing which one to use for which job.
Okay, let's give our listeners some red flag detectives. First up, clarity. Good writing should be easy to understand. So, one red flag is convoluted sentences. Those sentences that just go on and on. By the time you get to the end, you're like, wait, what was this even about?
Totally. If you have to reread a sentence a few times just to understand it, that's a sign it needs work. It's probably trying to do too much at once.
Right, like an overstuffed suitcase. You got to unpack it a bit.
Okay, so how do we unpack that overstuffed sentence and make it more manageable?
Break it down into smaller pieces. Each sentence should have one clear idea. That way the reader can follow along without getting lost.
Makes sense. Clarity is so important, especially if we want to keep the reader engaged.
Absolutely. And speaking of engagement, another red flag is using too much jargon or technical terms.
Oh yeah, those words that make you feel like you need a dictionary by your side.
Right. Unless you're writing for a super specific audience, it's best to use clear language that everyone understands. You want to bring the reader in, not make them feel excluded.
Yeah, it's like speaking a different language. If your reader doesn't understand what you're saying, they're not going to connect with your writing.
Totally. Now, let's talk about engagement itself. Good writing should grab the reader's attention, keep them hooked.
So what are some signs that our writing might not be engaging enough?
One big one is passive voice. Those sentences that feel kind of weak and indirect, they lack that punch that active voice has.
It's like watching a puppet show instead of a live performance. The action feels far away.
I like that. Active voice puts the focus on the actor. It makes the writing feel more dynamic and immediate.
So instead of saying the ball was thrown by the boy, it would be the boy threw the ball. Such a simple change, but it makes a big difference.
Right. Now, another red flag is a lack of sensory details. Good writing should appeal to all the senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch.
Sensory details are what make a story come alive. It's like the difference between reading a recipe and actually tasting the food.
Exactly. If your writing is all telling and no showing, the reader can't really experience the world you're creating.
They need to be able to see the colors, smell the aromas, feel the textures, all of it.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to emotional impact. We want our readers to feel something when they read our stories, right?
Totally. Like that moment in a song that gives you goosebumps or a scene in a movie that makes you cry. We want our writing to have that power.
Right. But there are some pitfalls to avoid here. One is melodrama. Those scenes that are so over the top that they feel fake.
It's like an actor trying too hard to cry. It just feels forced and insincere.
Exactly. True emotional impact comes from subtlety, from showing, not telling. Let the reader draw their own conclusions and connect with the characters on a deeper level.
And I think another red flag is cliches. Those phrases that have been used so often that they've lost all their meaning.
Cliches are like those old, worn-out saying that everyone's heard a million times. They don't spark the reader's imagination.
Instead, we want to use language that surprises and delights the reader, something fresh and original.
Okay, so we've talked about clarity, engagement, emotional impact. Now let's talk about something equally important, thought-provoking ideas. We want our writing to make the reader think, challenge their assumptions, maybe even see the world in a new way.
Like those books that stay with you long after you've finished reading them, the ones that make you question everything.
Right. But we have to be careful here. One red flag is preachiness. When it feels like the author is trying to force their opinions on you.
It's like being lectured to instead of having a conversation. It shuts down the dialogue and makes the reader feel like they're not allowed to have their own thoughts.
Exactly. We want to invite the reader to think critically, to consider different perspectives, and to draw their own conclusions.
So it's not about telling the reader what to think, but about giving them the space to think for themselves.
Right. And another pitfall to avoid is lack of depth. Stories that only scratch the surface. They don't really explore the complexities of life. Those stories can feel, I don't know, kind of empty.
Like you're just skimming the surface of a lake instead of diving deep into the water. We want our writing to explore the depths of human experience.
Exactly. Okay, finally, let's go back to enjoyability. Good writing should be, a pleasure to read, something you can't put down.
It's about crafting sentences that flow, using language that sparks the imagination, creating a reading experience that's both engaging and rewarding.
Absolutely. But there are some red flags here, too. Awkward phrasing is one. Those sentences that just don't sound quite right.
They sound clunky and, I don't know, amateurish, like a piano piece with a few wrong notes.
Exactly. We want our prose to be smooth and elegant, something that carries the reader along effortlessly.
Like a beautiful melody, every note in its place.
And another red flag is inconsistency. This could be inconsistency in tone, in style, even in voice.
It's like watching a movie where the genre keeps changing. You never know what to expect.
Right. We want our writing to have a sense of cohesion, like an orchestra playing in perfect harmony.
So to recap, we've talked about clarity, engagement, emotional impact, thought-provoking ideas, and enjoyability. What other red flags have you learned to watch out for in your own writer?
You know what gets me sometimes? Info dumping.
Info dumping. Tell me more about that.
It's when the writer just throws a ton of information at the reader all at once, usually in these long, dense paragraphs.
Like being handed a textbook instead of being invited into a story.
Yeah, it's a surefire way to lose your reader. Instead of info dumping, we want to weave information into the story organically. Reveal it gradually through dialogue, action, sensory details.
It's about finding that balance between giving the reader enough information to understand what's going on, but also leaving room for them to discover things on their own.
Right, and this goes back to showing, not telling. Instead of just stating facts, let the reader experience those facts through the character's senses and emotions.
That makes so much sense. It's about trusting the reader to put the pieces together.
You got it. And another thing that I still catch myself doing sometimes is overusing adverbs. We talked about this with the Stephen King quote, but it's worth repeating because it's such a common trap.
It's easy to rely on adverbs, especially when we're trying to convey a specific emotion or action. But as we said before, strong verbs are way more effective.
Totally. Instead of he walked slowly down the street, we could say he ambled, or he sauntered, or even he shuffled. Each verb gives you a different image, a different feeling.
It's like choosing the perfect color for a painting.
And speaking of paintings, another red flag is a weak narrative arc.
The story itself, the heart of the writing.
A good story should have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It should introduce us to characters we care about, give them challenges and conflicts, and take us on a journey.
Like going on an adventure, with twists and turns and unexpected discoveries along the way.
Exactly. And if that narrative arc is weak, the story loses its momentum. It just doesn't hold the reader's attention.
So how do we make sure our stories have a strong narrative arc? What should we be thinking about?
Well, first you need a clear conflict. What does the main character want? What's standing in their way? What are the stakes?
The conflict is what drives the story forward. It creates that tension, that sense of urgency that keeps us reading.
Exactly. And once you have the conflict, you need to develop it through rising action. These are the events that lead up to the climax.
The climax is like the peak of the story, right? The moment of truth.
Right. And after the climax, you have the falling action, where the consequences of the climax play out. And then, of course, the resolution.
So the conflict is resolved, and we see what happens to the characters in the end.
Right. And it doesn't always have to be a happy ending. Sometimes the most powerful stories leave us with questions, so make us think.
It's about creating a sense of closure, but also leaving room for interpretation.
Now, building on that idea of interpretation, another red flag is a weak or unclear theme.
The theme, the underlying message of the story.
Right. A strong theme adds depth and meaning to a story. It takes it beyond just entertainment. It makes us think about bigger ideas.
It's like the moral of the story, but without being preachy about it. It's the takeaway message, the thing that makes you think even after you've finished reading.
Exactly. And if a story doesn't have a clear theme, it can feel kind of pointless.
Okay, so how do we make sure our stories have a strong theme?
It starts with asking yourself, what do I want to say with this story? What message do I want to leave the reader with?
It's about going deeper than just the plot and the characters. It's about finding the heart of the story.
Exactly. And then you weave that theme into the story through the characters, the dialogue, their actions, everything.
Show, don't tell, right. Let the theme emerge naturally from the story itself.
Absolutely. This reminds me of something we talked about earlier. Finding inspiration. Sometimes the best way to figure out the theme is to just start writing and see where the story takes you.
It's about trusting the process and being open to where it leads you.
And as you write and revise, you can refine the theme, make it more nuanced and complex.
It's like the theme is a living thing that grows and evolves along with the story.
Now, speaking of growing and evolving, another red flag is a lack of character development.
Ah, yes, the characters, the people who bring the story to life.
Good characters feel real, they're relatable, they have flaws, they make mistakes, they grow and change throughout the story.
They're the ones we root for, the ones we get invested in.
Exactly. And if the characters are flat or underdeveloped, the story loses its emotional impact.
So how do we create characters that feel real and jump off the page?
Give them a rich inner life. What are their dreams, their fears, their motivations? What makes them tick?
It's about understanding them on a deeper level, not just their actions, but their thoughts and feelings.
Right. And then you reveal that inner life through their actions, their dialogue, their interactions with other characters.
Show, don't tell. Let the reader discover who they are through what they do and say.
And don't be afraid to give them flaws. No one's perfect. And flawed characters are often the most interesting.
Their flaws make them human. They make them relatable, make us care about them even more.
Exactly. And those flaws can also be a source of conflict, both internal and external.
It's about using those flaws to create obstacles for them to overcome, to make them grow and change.
Now, speaking of growth, another red flag is a weak character arc.
The character arc, the journey of transformation that a character goes through.
A strong character arc can be incredibly powerful. It lets us witness their struggles, their triumphs, their transformation.
It's about taking the reader on that journey with the character, making them feel like they're experiencing it all alongside them.
Exactly. And if that character arc is flat, the story loses its emotional punch.
So how do we craft character arcs that feel meaningful and engaging?
You start with a clear understanding where the character begins. Who are they at the start of the story? What are their flaws, their weaknesses? What needs to change?
You need to know their starting point to map out their journey.
Exactly. And then you challenge them. Force them to confront their flaws, to make difficult choices.
Push them out of their comfort zone, make them face their fears. That's how they grow.
Right. And as they overcome those challenges, they learn and change. They become stronger, more resilient.
It's showing the reader that growth is possible, even when things are tough.
Speaking of tough, another red flag is unbelievable conflict.
Conflict, the driving force of any story.
Right. Conflict can be external, like a battle against a villain, or internal, like a character struggling with self-doubt. But no matter what, it has to feel believable.
If it feels forced or fake, the reader won't care. The stakes won't feel real.
Right. So how do we create conflict that feels authentic?
I think it starts with understanding our characters. What do they want? What's stopping them from getting it? What are they willing to fight for?
Once you know their motivations, you can create conflict that makes sense for them. It feels organic to their story.
And we can also look to real life for inspiration. What are the conflicts that people face every day? What are the challenges that we all struggle with?
By tapping into those universal experiences, we can create conflict that feels real and relatable.
And that brings us back to finding inspiration. Sometimes the best inspiration is all around us, in the everyday lives of people.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about something that's a little harder to define: voice.
Voice. That thing that makes a writer's work unique and memorable.
It's the personality that comes through in the writing. The writer's perspective, their tone, their style.
It's what makes a writer stand out, what makes their work feel authentic and engaging.
Exactly. And if a story doesn't have a strong voice, it can feel generic, like something anyone could have written.
So how do we develop our own unique voice?
You can't really force it. It's something that develops naturally as you write, as you experiment, as you find your own style.
It's about being true to yourself, to your own experiences, and your own way of seeing the world.
Right. And it also helps to read a lot. Pay attention to the voices of other writers and learn from what they do.
By reading widely, we start to understand what we like, what we don't like, what works and what doesn't.
And over time, as you keep writing, your own voice will emerge.
It's a journey of self-discovery.
Now, let's talk about a perspective, specifically point of view.
Point of view, the perspective from which the story is told.
Choosing the right point of view is so important. It creates intimacy. It shapes how the reader experiences the story.
The wrong point of view can create distance, make it hard for the reader to connect with the characters and the story.
Exactly. So what are the different points of view and how do we choose the right one?
The main ones are first person, second person, and third person.
First person is when the story is told from the I perspective. It's like we're inside the character's head, experiencing everything through their eyes.
Second person uses you, addressing the reader directly. It can be really effective for drawing the reader in, but it can also be tricky to pull off.
And then there's third person, where the story is told from an outside perspective using he, she, or they.
And even within third person, there are different levels of intimacy. Third person limited lets us into one character's thoughts, while third person omniscient lets us see into multiple characters' minds.
The best point of view depends on the story you're telling, the effect you want to create, and how close you want the reader to feel to the characters.
It's about experimenting and finding what works best for each story.
Now let's revisit cliches, but this time in terms of language and imagery.
We talked about them with emotional impact, but they can be just as problematic when it comes to the words and images we use.
Cliches are those overused phrases and expressions that have become, well, cliche. They've lost their freshness and impact.
Like a coin that's been handled so many times that the details have worn away.
Exactly. When we rely on cliches, our writing feels stale and predictable. We want to use language that surprises the reader, that makes them see things in a new way.
It's about finding new ways to describe things, to create imagery that's both vivid and unexpected.
And this ties back to finding inspiration. Sometimes the best way to avoid cliches is to simply look at the world with fresh eyes. Pay attention to the details. Describe what you see in your own unique way.
Speaking of details, let's talk about sensory details again. We touched on this before, but it's so important.
Sensory details are what make a story come alive. They help the reader to experience the world you're creating with all their senses.
Without sensory details, a story can feel flat and lifeless, like a black and white photo compared to a full-color image.
So how do we make sure our writing is full of sensory details?
Well, it starts with paying attention to our own senses. What do we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch in our everyday lives?
And we can also draw inspiration from the world around us. What are the sensory details that make a place or an experience memorable?
And then we use those details to create vivid descriptions and evoke emotions in the reader.
It's like we're painting a picture with words, creating an immersive experience for the reader.
Okay, so we've got our sensory details down. Now, what about setting?
Ah, yes, setting. The time and place where the story happens.
A well-developed setting is more than just a backdrop. It can be a character in itself, shaping the mood and influencing the characters.
It's the stage where the story unfolds, and the right setting can transport the reader, make them feel like they're really there.
Exactly. And if the setting feels generic or underdeveloped, the story loses its sense of place. It doesn't capture the reader's imagination.
So how do we create settings that are rich and evocative?
Well, I think research is key. Whether you're writing about a real place or a fictional one, you need to understand it. The history, the culture, the geography, all of it.
Exactly. And once you have that understanding, you bring it to life through your writing. Use sensory details, historical fact, cultural nuances, all of those things can make the setting feel real.
It's about treating the setting as an integral part of the story, not just a background.
And remember, inspiration can come from anywhere. Explore the world around you, pay attention to the details, and let your imagination run wild.
Okay, so we've got setting covered. Now let's talk about something a little trickier, originality.
Ah, yes. Originality, that quality that makes a story stand out from the crowd, makes it feel fresh and exciting.
It's about bringing something new to the table, a unique plot, a fresh perspective, a voice that we haven't heard before.
Exactly. And if a story lacks originality, it can feel derivative, like it's been done before.
Like listening to a cover band instead of a band that writes their own songs.
So how do we make sure our stories are original?
I think it starts with being true to ourselves. What are our unique experiences? What stories can only we tell?
It's about tapping into our own creativity, our own voice.
And we can also look to the world around us for inspiration. There are so many untold stories out there, so many new perspectives waiting to be shared.
Be curious, observe, listen, experiment. That's how you find those sparks of originality.
And that brings us back to inspiration again. Sometimes stepping outside our comfort zone, trying new things, is the best way to find those original ideas.
Absolutely. Now, what about the message?
The message, the deeper meaning behind the story.
A strong message can make a story more than just entertainment. It can make us think, make us feel, even change how we see the world.
It's like the moral of the story, but in a more subtle way.
Right. And if a story lacks a message, it can feel kind of empty, like it doesn't have a purpose.
So how do we make sure our stories have a clear and compelling message?
It starts with asking yourself, what do I want to say with this story? What truth do I want to explore? What impact do I want to have on the reader?
It's about finding the heart of the story, what it's really about beneath the surface.
Exactly. And then you weave that message into the story through the characters, their choices, the events that unfold.
Show, don't tell, again, let the message unfold naturally.
Now let's talk about something that's often overlooked, pacing.
Pacing, the speed and rhythm of the story.
Pacing is so important for keeping the reader engaged. A well-paced story will keep them turning the pages, wanting to know what happens next.
If it's too slow, it can feel like a drag, too fast, and it can feel rushed and confusing.
Exactly. So how do we make sure our stories are well-paced?
It starts with understanding the structure of the story. Where are the key moments? Where do we need to slow down to build tension? Where do we need to speed up to keep the momentum going?
We can use different techniques to control the pace, varying sentence length, switching between action and dialogue, even creating cliffhangers.
It's like finding the right rhythm for the story.
Speaking of endings, let's not forget about the conclusion.
Ah, yes, the ending, the grand finale.
A good ending should tie up loose ends, resolve the conflicts, and leave the reader feeling satisfied. It should also resonate with the themes and the message of the story.
If the ending feels rushed or unearned, it can ruin the whole story.
Right. So how do we make sure our endings are satisfying?
I think planning is key. Know where you're going with the story and how you want it to end.
We can also use techniques like foreshadowing, callbacks, and thematic resonance to make the ending feel inevitable and satisfying.
It's about making sure the ending feels earned, like it's the natural conclusion to everything that came before it.
Speaking of knowing where you're going, another red flag is not having a clear target audience in mind.
Ah, yes, the audience, the people we're writing for.
Knowing your audience is crucial. It influences everything about the story, from the language you use to the themes you explore.
If you don't know who you're writing for, it's like shooting arrows in the dark. You might hit something, but it's more likely you'll miss completely.
So how do we figure out who our target audience is?
Start by asking yourself, who is most likely to enjoy this story? What are their interests, their values, their demographics?
You can also do some research, look at other books in your genre. What are their target audiences like? What are the current trends and preferences?
By understanding our audience, we can make sure our story connects with them on a deeper level.
Now, let's not forget about the importance of humor.
Humor, it can make a story so much more enjoyable and memorable.
Humor can be a powerful tool. It can help us deal with tough topics, connect with our readers, and make our stories more engaging.
But it can also be tricky. If it's not done well, it can fall flat or even offend.
Exactly. So how do we use humor effectively?
I think it starts with knowing your audience. What kind of humor do they appreciate? What are their boundaries?
You can also experiment with different types of humor: wordplay, satire, irony, slapstick. It's about finding what works for your story and your audience.
And using it in a way that feels natural and authentic.
Speaking of authentic, another red flag is a weak authorial voice.
Authorial voice. That unique quality that makes a writer's work stand out.
It's the personality that shines through the writing, the writer's perspective, their tone, their style. It's what makes their work feel real and engaging.
It's what makes us connect with a writer and want to read more of their work.
Exactly. And if a story lacks authorial voice, it can feel generic and forgettable.
So how do we develop our own authorial voice?
It's not something you can force. It comes naturally as you write more, experiment more, find your own style.
Be true to yourself, your experiences, your perspective on the world.
And read a lot. Pay attention to the voices of other writers. Learn from them.
By reading widely, we start to develop our own sense of what works and what doesn't, what we like and what we don't like.
And as we keep writing, our own voice will emerge.
It's a journey of self-discovery.
Now, speaking of journeys, let's talk about narrative structure.
Narrative structure, the framework of a story, how it's organized and presented.
A strong narrative structure keeps the reader engaged and invested in the story. It provides a clear path through the events, builds suspense, and creates a satisfying sense of closure.
If the narrative structure is kind of like the architecture of the story, right? If it's not solid, the whole thing falls apart.
Totally. And there are tons of different structures out there, the three-act structure, experimental forms, you name it. The important thing is to pick one that works for your story, that helps you achieve what you're going for.
Like choosing the right blueprint for a house. You wouldn't build a mansion the same way you'd build a cottage.
Exactly. And speaking of cottages, another thing to watch out for is a weak sense of place.
Place, yeah. It's like the heart of the setting.
Right. And it's more than just describing what the place looks like. It's about the feel of it, the atmosphere, the mood.
You want the reader to feel like they're actually there, to experience it with all their senses.
Exactly. And that brings us back to sensory details, those vivid descriptions that help transport the reader, create that immersive experience.
It's like you're creating a portal with your words, drawing the reader right into the story.
I love that. And, this all comes back to that question we started with. What is good writing? It's clearly more than just grammar and punctuation.
It's about using language to create something that matters, something that connects with the reader, that stays with them.
It's about building a world that feels real, with characters we care about, conflicts that keep us hooked. And it's about leaving the reader with a sense of satisfaction. Like, yeah, that was a good story.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive is that good writing is a process. It's not about being perfect right away. It's about learning, experimenting, and constantly refining your craft.
Couldn't agree more. There's always something new to learn, new ways to improve.
So to everyone listening, keep writing, keep exploring, keep challenging yourselves. And most importantly, believe in the power of your own unique voice.
There are so many stories out there waiting to be told. Go out there and tell yours.
Beautifully said. And on that note, until next time, happy writing, everyone.